Welcome to the next installment of Mr. Bellamy is Not Here. Yay! Just kidding. Hope you're all sad and miserable that I'm not here. Today is October 25th, or unless you're watching this in subsequent years, who knows what today is. But for today at least, we got a couple things to talk about. The three main things I want to get through. I've been kind of touching on this hit and miss, but George Washington was a tough guy. I want to give you some examples of why I think he's so tough, besides the things that we talk about with his intelligence when it comes to fighting battles, with being able to defeat the British or being able to defeat the French in the French and Indian War when the British were fighting against the French. We'll talk about a couple of battles where Washington strategically is more intelligent than the British soldiers that he's going up against at Trenton and Saratoga, for instance. And when those things are finished, I would like you to use the rest of your time to continue working on your fill-in notes. So as the video is playing today, work on your fill-in notes. If you need help with that, make sure you ask and get some help. And please continue working on your study guide. By the time today is over, you could/should probably have about half of your study guide done. Chapter 6 is not a super long chapter, so it's not like we're going to be spending weeks on it. Probably another week or so, and we should be about wrapped up with Chapter 6, the American Revolution, and ready to move on to, or excuse me, Chapter 7 is where we're at now. I keep saying 6, and ready to move on with the next business. So, a couple reminders. Anybody that wants a retake on the test, the Chapter 5-6 test, retakes by the end of the day tomorrow. Obviously, I'm not here on Wednesday, but I will be here on Thursday, so you can come in before school if you'd like. You can come in during when. You can come in after school. I should be here to take care of you at any of those times. Remember, the only prerequisite to retake my test, besides you better study, is you need a note or an email sent to me from your parental that says they know you've studied and you're better prepared for the test this time. So don't let the fact that this grade is your first grade of second quarter keep you from doing a retake. If it's necessary, please take advantage of opportunities to get your grade up. So end of the day, Thursday, unless you have a special circumstance, and then make sure you send me an email and let me know what's going on so that we can take care of each other. Now, before we get started, I found this fascinating, but I found this article a few years ago that talked about the 9 deadly diseases that plagued George Washington. These are all diseases that could kill, like, for instance, diseases, some of them we have today and some of them we don't. Some of them exist outside of the United States and some of them don't exist here. Tuberculosis was a killer. Malaria was a killer. Malaria caused by a mosquito bite, something that small. Smallpox was definitely a killer. Dysentery, we've talked briefly about a killer, but the guy ultimately dies at 67 years old, which to us today isn't that old, but back then it was relative old age. But he died from a throat infection, for crying out loud. So, some things that he survived would kill the average person, and then he dies from something that probably today was relatively easy to fix. So if we take a look, his list of illnesses throughout his life were crazy. One of them was called diphtheria. It's usually a childhood infection. Washington had it when he was about 15 years old. It strikes in 2 stages, starting out with a sore throat and then a risk of suffocation because your throat swells up. It creates a toxin which circulates throughout the body, weakening the heart, and you could drop dead several weeks or even years later from diphtheria as a young man. As early as 1895, we're able to treat the second stage of the illness with an antitoxin, and since 1930s, we don't have to worry about treatments or side effects. We just prevent it with a vaccine. So in the United States today, we have about a half a dozen cases of diphtheria per year in kids who are not immunized. The second one was tuberculosis. Washington's brother had this, and a common treatment back then was for a doctor to prescribe breathing in the fresh air. So Washington's half-brother, Lawrence, and him moved to an island country in the Caribbean called Barbados. And on that trip, Washington ended up getting sick himself. It's an infection in the lining of the coating of the lungs. Like malaria, it's one of those diseases that can go quiet but continue to attack later in life. Still today, tuberculosis is common. There are about 15 to 20,000 cases in the United States every year, and globally, about 8.5 million people contract tuberculosis. About a million or more will die from it, even today. Even though we have wonderful antibiotics to treat it, some strains of tuberculosis have become resistant to those drugs. So, diphtheria, tuberculosis. Washington had a case of smallpox at the age of 19. You all have that image of smallpox sketched into your brain that you'll never forget. A serious disease with blistery lesions all over your face, all across your body. Its effects on the internal organs are what kills 1 out of every 3 victims. So 30% of people, white people that contracted smallpox, would die from it. Washington survived but did have scarring and pox on his face. We look at the pictures that we see of George Washington, and those don't exist because the artists that created the pictures purposely leave them out. Knowing how bad it could be, it played a revolutionary role by having all of the Continental Army soldiers vaccinated. So George Washington understood that exposing them to a small dose of smallpox might render them able to fight off the real pox. So much of his army was vaccinated, even at a time before vaccines were well understood. You could also use it as a weapon when you knew that an army wasn't vaccinated. Washington also suffered multiple times from something called dysentery. This one's my favorite. Today, it's typically defined as bloody dysentery, which also contains a mucus in the liquid-like stools. So it's bloody diarrhea. Cha, cha, cha. Washington had this many, many times, including when he was fighting the French and Indian War. At one point, he was sitting on a pillow because his rear end was in agony from diarrhea and booty pain. His butt hurt. He also may have suffered from a case of hemorrhoids at the same time. So he put a pillow underneath him while riding on his horse. He was in a terrible battle and sitting erect on the pillow, putting him at risk anyway, and Washington was known to be a great horseman of the time, but he could have easily been shot, and things turned out much differently for our country. At one point, his horse was shot out from under him. Washington reached up and grabbed the reins of a passing by riderless horse and took off on a gallop until he realized that his rear end still hurt. So he actually turned around, untied the pillow off of his dead horse, and tied it to his fresh horse so he could ride off without his rear end hurting so bad. Today, the treatment would be oral rehydration. So you could literally poop yourself to death with diarrhea. In fact, it's commonly believed that dysentery is the leading killer of mankind throughout all of human history. And if it's bacterial, it can be treated fairly easily. There were other things such as parasites that also could cause dysentery. So malaria, probably G-Dub had malaria at the age of 17. It's a fever, it comes and goes away, it's active and then it's quiet. So Washington had bouts of malaria throughout his whole life. We tend to think of it now as a developing nation disease, but well into the 19th century, the 1800s, malaria was common in America, even in places like Michigan and Minnesota. The greatest prevention for malaria is mosquito control, so draining swamps and stuff like that. But in the world today, about 1 million people die from malaria each year, so still a very deadly disease. Another one was quinsy, one that most of us have never heard about. It's an antiquated 18th century term, so the 1700s, that refers to tonsillitis. It's an infection of those hanging-downy tonsils in the back of your throat. Washington was diagnosed with this on several occasions. His quinsy attacks did not seem to have been life-threatening, but in the event of infection and dangerous bacteria, such events could prove to be fatal. Today, if you come down with something like strep throat, we have antibiotics for that. At one point in 1795, George Washington suffered from something called a carbuncle. It was a bump on his face that some thought might be a cancerous tumor, but it could have been caused by a bacteria. We just don't know. If it was cancerous, a deadly form of skin cancer, we still don't have good treatments for that. On the other hand, if it was a pre-skin cancer, we would remove it today and slather on some sunscreen and take care of your skin a little bit better. Skin cancers tend to be more common today than they were in Washington's time because of reduction in the ozone layer, which protects us from the direct rays of the sun. GW also had pneumonia. Today we've got plenty of antibiotics for pneumonia. If you get pneumonia, you have a high fever, difficulty breathing, and you can get sick. You usually feel better in 48 hours or so. If you're hospitalized, you can be hooked up to a machine that helps you breathe. Today, most people will survive unless you get old and a bad infection. And then finally, Washington suffered toward the end of his life with something called epiglottis, which tends to be a form of influenza. We don't exactly know what happened when Washington was out riding on his horse in Mount Vernon on a cold day in the winter after he left the presidency after 8 years. So this is much after the time we're talking about in class right now. But he had a sore throat, and within hours he was having trouble swallowing. A few days later it got worse, and thought to be due to an excess of blood. So back then doctors tended to think that disease was in the blood, and if they removed the blood, it might help remove the disease. Within 12 hours they removed about 80 ounces of blood, or 35% of his entire blood. Keeping in mind today, we know that if you're sick, you don't want to give blood because it also contains white blood cells which keep you healthy or fight off disease. They bled him quite a bit, and that's probably what finally caused George Washington to die. So had he had epiglottis today and had trouble breathing, we have respirators to take care of that, or even a tracheotomy or a tube in your throat. But today, bloodletting is not something we recommend. But even in 2012, some of the best doctors in the world were still prescribing it. So George suffered from a lot of weird diseases that would kill most people back then, and today, not too much of a concern. So kind of an interesting thing. We left off the other day in class talking about this quote from Colonel Rahl, kind of giving you the idea that the British really think they're a big deal. All we got to do is go at them with the bayonet, the knife on the end of the gun. That's pretty arrogant for them to think. But let's take a look at what Washington thinks about their prediction. December 25th, 1776. So we've only declared independence a few months earlier, and this war is just really heating up. And we know that the British have hired a bunch of mercenaries, and it's wintertime. And historically, wintertime, there's not a lot of fighting that goes on because it's such a miserable time for both armies, just trying to stay alive and not freeze to death and find a plentiful supply of food. And if you were to pick one day throughout the year that would be the least likely time to have to worry about an attack, it's Christmas Day, December 25th. So if Washington is thinking, and he knows he's outmanned and outnumbered and outgunned by the British and their Hessian mercenaries almost all the time, maybe the perfect time to attack would be Christmas Day. So Washington orders his army to march to Trenton, New Jersey. This is a nighttime attack. Snow is coming down. The roads, the small roads are icy. But first they have to cross the Delaware River. It is freezing cold. These men don't have warm insulated coats and warm insulated gloves and shoes the way we've got. Some of them don't even have shoes. They just bind their feet in cloth. And these guys are tougher than we could even imagine to be. And they're crossing a Delaware River that's covered in snow and ice. And they've got to not only get themselves across, but they've got to get their horses across. And they have to do this with sneaky tactics. So George doesn't even tell his men they're going to do it until they're almost ready to do it. So crossing the Delaware River in the middle of the night with chunks of ice on boats that aren't made for this, with their horses, with their guns, with their supplies, is going to be a really difficult thing. And they have to do it without the British soldiers or these Hessian mercenaries. Remember, the guys that are supposed to be 6'4" with pointy teeth and blood dripping off of them, at knowing that they're coming. When they get there, Washington only has a little bit more than a third of the force of troops that he was supposed to be bringing, and it's almost daylight, so he has no choice but to go now. He can't wait for the rest of his troops to get across the river. And as he attacks, he completely catches the mercenaries by surprise. It's not even quite dawn on the morning of Christmas Day, and here comes George Washington, literally catching the Hessian army with their pants down. They haven't come out of their tents. Their guns are lined up in rows outside their tents. They're not prepared for this. And here comes George Washington capturing or killing up to 900 Hessian mercenaries. Now, these numbers that we see here, if we read 10 different history books, we'd probably see 10 different numbers. Some say 1,100 Hessian mercenaries were killed or captured. Remember, most of them not killed, most of them are taken prisoner. And remember, these Hessians are fighting for a paycheck. So when it comes to a cause, their cause is to get paid. And if they get dead, they don't make any money. So besides capturing these mercenaries, G-Dub also gets all of their guns, all of their powder, all of their ammunition, and all of their food supplies. And then he's happy to turn them loose because he doesn't really need those mercenaries anyway. Or maybe do a prisoner swap for his own men. And as a result, George Washington, it's recognized that this guy knows what he's doing and has strategic tactics that are very valuable. Thinking about crossing a river in the middle of the night that's covered in snow and ice without torches and lights really isn't very smart thinking for us, but actually George had to cross the river, I think, 3 times that night. So might have been a little crazy, but the tactics were good. This is the image that most people see when they imagine Washington crossing the Delaware. This picture was painted probably 10 years after the event. It's probably not all that realistic. Actually, more like 30 years after the event. So there was no witness to it that painted this picture. And you see some things going on in it, like George Washington standing on this thing like Captain Morgan. You know, you got a little captain in you. Well, rule number 1 about being on a rowboat is you're not standing, for crying out loud, especially with chunks of ice and waves and stuff. Back here we can see George Washington's horse, this big white horse. It's getting ready to cross over, and just endless boats ferrying men across. Again, lining up the boats and getting everything ready without his men knowing and without the British soldiers or the Hessian mercenaries finding out is a miracle in and of itself. But probably not standing there. But again, look at the clothes. They don't have gloves. They don't have ski masks. These were tough guys. And it makes us kind of wonder how weak we are today that we need all those things. But G-Dub was a pretty tough guy. I'm going to back up for a minute, and I've got a brief video that I want to play for you that's about the Battle of Trenton, where we see these mercenaries captured. So watch, please.
These are the times that try men's souls. Oh, Ben, Tom Paine said that, not you. Anyway, old Tom was right when he penned that line on December 23rd, 1776. But I was in a bind. The Continental Army had been dealt with many defeats, and enlistments were up for a lot of the men at the end of the year. So I had to act
Remember,
quickly.
1-year term of service.
With the British retiring to winter quarters along the Delaware River, Washington decided to capitalize on this. On Christmas Day, 1776, Washington planned to cross the Delaware River to strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. I didn't tell my men until I absolutely had to in order to keep the mission a secret. I know it seems irrational to cross an icy river in the middle of a nor'easter pouring down snow and sleet, but I knew that that was the only way to surprise those Hessian mercenaries. We actually knew in advance about Washington's plans, but given his track record to date, we didn't think it was so serious. In fact, we told our Hessian troops in Trenton to enjoy their Christmas festivities, but be vigilant.
That's obviously a British guy speaking, and by all accounts, the Hessian mercenaries in Trenton did not overdo it on Christmas Eve. They were sober compared to a lot of people in textbooks that say they were maybe a little bit hungover or inebriated from the festivities the night before.
We Patriots knew what we were doing installing Washington as general. He knew time was his greatest enemy and was trying to arrive in Trenton by 5 a.m. to surprise those Hessians. Yeah, but you know the weather in the winter. It's rough. Although we were over 3 hours behind schedule, I knew we had to charge on. On Christmas evening, Washington's army commenced its crossing of the half-frozen Delaware River spread across 3 locations. Washington led nearly 2,400 soldiers across the icy and freezing river and reached the New Jersey side of the river at dawn. As we were making our way across the Delaware, the wind and snow picked up as it got colder and colder. I just didn't know if we were going to make it. I had my doubts and thought that at some point we should maybe turn back, but I was determined to push on. In addition to Washington's troops, there were two other Patriot forces attempting to cross the Delaware. Colonel Cadwalader was to lead his force of 1,200 Philadelphia militiamen and 600 Continentals across the river near Burlington, New Jersey. General James Ewing's force of nearly 800 Pennsylvania militiamen was to cross the river directly opposite of Trenton. Wow, Ricky, I'm freezing cold just thinking about this. Yeah, Virgil, little known fact that the majority of the Patriots didn't make it across the Delaware River in time. Washington and the Continental Army arrived at Trenton just as the sun rose on December 26, 1776. We were freezing after the crossing. We barely had enough clothes on our backs, much less sufficient food supplies. Some of my fellow soldiers really suffered from frostbite. The army took the nearly 1,400 Hessians under Colonel Johann Rau completely by surprise, with one column commanded by Nathaniel Greene attacking from the north and another commanded by John Sullivan attacking from the west, so that the Hessians couldn't retreat south. Yep, those Hessians didn't know what hit them. Some of the Hessians escaped, but we were able to capture most of them, including their leader, Rau, who was mortally wounded. Washington really nailed this one.
Mortally wounded means he would die from his wounds.
Hit the Hessians at the perfect time. Yep, the Hessians were sleeping it in after their Christmas parties. This daring action by Washington and his men showed the British that we Patriots were down but not out. We Americans had defeated a major garrison and suffered only 5 men wounded in action. The Hessians, on the other hand, had 22 men killed, 83 wounded, and almost 1,000 missing and captured. Yep, and that wasn't the only Delaware crossing. We crossed the river a couple more times. The second crossing was the hardest because we had to ferry the prisoners and supplies we had captured back across the river. The Battle of Trenton wasn't a huge strategic success for the Patriots, but it was a real morale booster for the Army, and it showed the British that the Continental Army could win. The Battle of Trenton was a real wake-up call for us. We had just come off a string of wins in New York and thought we could enjoy a little R&R and Christmas festivities. Honestly, we didn't think Washington could pull off any victory, but we were wrong. I would go almost as far to say that if we didn't prevail at Trenton, the war may have been lost. It was sort of our last chance.
Kind of a rerun of what we just talked about. If we move on, one more quick battle, and we won't spend too much time on it. But Great Britain had a strategy the next spring, and
This video covers the Siege of Boston and 4 critical battles that took place in 1776.
Never mind that, sorry. So the British had what they called a 3-pronged plan of attack, which is sort of like a fork if you look at the prongs on your fork, except they're coming from different directions. So it was a plan to destroy the Continental Army, George Washington's army near Albany, New York. And think about the difficulty in this. Well, let me go through this first. First, let's send General John Burgoyne south from Canada. So he's got an army of British soldiers in Canada, which is British territory, headed south towards Albany, New York. And if you look at a map, Albany, New York's not that far from Canada. Colonel Thomas St. Leger is going to come from the west, and General Howe will come up the Hudson River from New York City. So the idea was to give Washington no place to retreat from. The problem that they had, though, was G-Dub found out about this ahead of time and knew that it was coming, so he had an opportunity to retreat. And here's the real difficulty. The weather isn't going to cooperate. They're going to be heading into winter, so I said spring, but this is a late summer activity. Communication is nearly impossible. So they're given these orders, and General Johnny Burgoyne has to come down at the same time as St. Leger and the same time as General Howe. And if they don't converge on Albany at the same time, their plan is no good at all. George Washington will just go out the route that's not blocked. But there isn't any communication because it would take a horse and rider weeks and weeks and weeks for Burgoyne to send word to St. Leger, who could send word to Howe. So it's not like today where we just get on the cell phone and call each other up or use the radio or something like that to communicate our strategies and our battles. And armies didn't move at the speed of light like we do today, not literally, but figuratively, using tanks and trucks and planes. We can move our militaries very quickly. Yeah, they're marching with most soldiers on foot and difficulties that way. So their plan is sound. It makes all sorts of sense, but General John Burgoyne was really slow. That's why there's so many W's there. General Howe stopped to capture Philadelphia, which wasn't part of the plans. He made that decision on his own. So we obviously have issues among the ranks of the British leadership in not all being on the same page when it comes to following orders. And because he captured Howe, he decided to stick around because winter was coming. So he stayed for the winter. He's now not part of this plan. And St. Leger is defeated by another great American general named Benedict Arnold, who we'll talk about later on for a different reason. Benedict Arnold is famous for something besides defeating St. Leger and stopping this three-pronged plan of attack at Albany. So the plan fails, and therefore George Washington gets this great victory at Saratoga, New York. The Continental Army surrounds General Burgoyne and fires on him day and night, keeping him under siege. We've talked about siege before. If Burgoyne has nowhere to go and he's surrounded and doesn't have the ammunition or manpower to fire back and break free, he's got no choice but to surrender. And it's hard to see in this image, but you see General Johnny Burgoyne handing over his sword to George Washington. Not sure how true this part of the story is. I'm not sure 100% if General Washington was actually at the surrender or if he sent one of his men. But Burgoyne's men that would have had to have surrendered all of their ammunition and powder and all of their equipment and supplies and cannon and all of that stuff. So a couple huge victories. And because of this victory, it's considered the turning point of the war. Now, we've condensed this war down into a much, much smaller event than it actually is, because we really haven't talked about the British having a whole lot of success. But here I am telling you that this is the turning point of the war, because for the very first time it looks as if this ragtag group of Continental soldiers, Washington's army, who's barely paid and barely has enough uniforms and equipment and food to survive, might, just maybe, might have a chance to win. So that's why it's called the turning point. Up to this time, the rest of the world would be sitting back and watching and thinking, there's no way this group of Americans has a chance to win this war. Now, all of a sudden, the French and the Spanish, maybe they're looking at this and thinking, there could be a chance. And if the French and the Spanish and maybe some other people believe that the Americans have a chance, maybe they're willing to kick in and help out a little bit, which is kind of where we'll be going in subsequent classes. Other countries don't like the British, so when they see an opportunity to slap them upside the head, they're going to take advantage of that opportunity. So winning at the Battle of Saratoga is a huge victory for George Washington, bigger than the Battle of Trenton. And a lot of it boils down to lack of communication and a willingness or an unwillingness to follow orders by those British commanders. Couple of vocab, and then I want to show you a short video. Neutral is not taking sides, so we've talked about that in the past. We can talk about that more down the road. A pacifist is someone who refuses to fight, like Quakers, for instance, were pacifists. A mercenary is a paid professional soldier, like the Hessians that were defeated at Trenton. They're not gone, by the way. There are still mercenaries fighting in this war. And some people on Tuesday made mention when we talked about conflict that in the in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the Russians for a long, long time had hired a mercenary group called the Wagner Group. Not sure how much they're doing right now to help the Russians, but they were paid professional soldiers. And a strategy is just exactly that. It's a plan of action. So we're going to watch a second video here. This one is the Battle for Saratoga.
In late 1777, the British Redcoats hoped to crush the American fighting forces once and for all. The British were really worried foreign powers like France could join the war. We needed to take New York conclusively and keep the pesky French from joining the war. So the plan was to send a strong army down the Lake Champlain route from Canada into the heart of the rebellious American colonies and essentially isolating New England. The British planned to have 3 armies converge at Albany, New York. The British believed that taking control of Albany and the rest of the Hudson Valley would effectively cut off ruling New England. General John Burgoyne began marching down the Hudson Valley from Canada in the summer of 1777. Along the way, Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga in July. Lieutenant Colonel St. Ledger started traveling east across the Mohawk Valley, but was stopped in his tracks in conflicts with local forces and Benedict Arnold. General Howe was supposed to march north to support Burgoyne, but he was tied up in his campaign to capture Philadelphia. At the end of the day, Burgoyne was alone without reinforcements to take on the American forces. And my men under General Horatio Gates were waiting for General Burgoyne's army. We weren't going to miss anything. There were actually 2 battles of Saratoga, 18 days apart. The first was known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm. On September 19th, some of my troops got involved with part of General Gates' army near the abandoned farm of John Freeman. Neither side was able to gain the upper hand until some Hessian auxiliary troops came late in the day and gave the British the advantage, forcing the Continental Army to pull back. Even so, those pesky British regulars couldn't continue to push to Albany like they wanted to, because we had inflicted twice as many casualties on them. So the result was a British win at Freeman's Farm, not necessarily a good omen for Gates's troops. I knew my numbers were down, so I didn't want to stay put and wait for reinforcements to arrive. Unfortunately, Gates had the same idea and ended up amassing over 13,000 men in the next several weeks. We were fed up waiting for reinforcements from New York, so I decided to spring a surprise attack. On October 7th, General Burgoyne tried to attack the Continental Army's left flank near Bemis Heights, just south of Saratoga. But the Americans successfully defended the attack and broke his army. The battle became known as the Second Battle of Saratoga, or the Battle of Bemis Heights. Even Benedict Arnold, who would later become a traitor to the Americans, played a significant role in defeating us. During the Battle of Bemis Heights, he ignored Gates' order and led an assault on horseback. Did you know that traitor Benedict Arnold played important roles in early American wins in the Revolution? In fact, Arnold resigned his Army commission in July 1777, but Washington refused it and sent him north to serve under Gates. Poor Arnold never felt appreciated by his country and later turned a traitor, joining the British. Old Burgoyne and his men tried to escape, but the cold weather and heavy rain slowed them down. They had to dig in to prepare to defend themselves, but my man Gates and his soldiers had the upper hand. They surrounded Burgoyne's army, forcing them to surrender. And it was a good thing, because back in Pennsylvania, the Continental Army serving under me had unfortunately suffered a big fat defeat at the Battle of Brandywine, which led to the British occupation of Philadelphia a couple weeks later. In addition to offensive actions taken by the Continental Army, British mishaps and delays forced Burgoyne's troops to fight Gates's fast-growing army alone, which greatly diminished any possibility of a final British win. I negotiated with the Americans for a week before I finally capitulated. Oh, it was a glorious sight to see the haughty Brits march out and surrender to the Continental Army, which they had despised. The Battle of Saratoga, or both of them if you want to be precise, was a huge success for the Americans, prompting France and other foreign powers to join the Americans in the revolution to fight against the British.
So that's where we'll be going in coming class periods, is to talk about what is it that the French and the Spanish, maybe Poland and other places have to contribute to America's cause against the British. We are fighting against a country that almost everyone in the world despises, so it can't be that tough. We'll also spend some time in coming classes talking about how this conflict can be very similar to most wars that have been fought throughout American history. We could even make some comparisons with the conflict going on between, or the war going on between Russia and Ukraine, not just from a mercenary standpoint, but also from a strategy standpoint. It almost seems like the Russians make a lot of the same mistakes that the British made in their overconfidence to defeat the Americans, or their overconfidence to defeat the Ukrainians. So those of you that have a little bit more background knowledge in that conflict, you certainly have some understanding that we can talk about later on. So I apologize that I'm absent again today. It's nothing that I could do to help, but keep plugging away. You should now, with the rest of class time, work on making sure you're up to date with your fill-in notes, and make sure that you are filling out your study guide. So by today, you should be probably halfway done with your study guide. And then if you get done with that, you can read a book or work on IXL, but there shouldn't be anyone that has nothing to do. Thanks for your cooperation, guys. I will be here on Friday. I'll see you then.